All right, thank you again, everyone, for joining us for this FedNow Community Solution Series webinar. I'm Sierra Christian Daniels on the FedNow Community Programming team, and I want to get a few logistical items out of the way before our speakers present here. So before we begin, if you're having difficulty with your audio, you can select the switch audio option from the audio and video menu at the top of your screen. The preferred browser, if you don't have the WebEx application, is Google Chrome or Firefox. All of the attendees have been muted for the session when you joined, and you will remain muted for the duration of the session. I'd like to thank everyone who submitted questions with your registration. That was so helpful to us. So while some of those questions will be answered over the course of the presentation, we may not be able to make it through all of the questions and responses. If you have any questions, please submit those along with the post-event survey, which will be distributed to you following this event. Or you can email us at our FedNow community inbox, which is sys@fednowcommunity.chi.frb.org. And finally, there are very many helpful and educational resources on FedNow Explorer and on frbservices.org. So please be sure to reference those at your leisure. So now I'd like to hand the session over to Mike Timoney, who will be our moderator for today, to introduce himself and our panelists. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Sierra. As Sierra mentioned, my name is Mike Timoney, and I'm a vice president within the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, where I lead a team based in secure payments. And what that means is literally our team works and collaborates with the payments industry to try and identify gaps or vulnerabilities within our payment system. And then ultimately, we work together to identify potential or possible solutions for those vulnerabilities. And so as someone that's worked in fraud for a long time, and part of my job, I talked to a lot of different fraud experts and payments experts. And so I always like to hear something new, gets me thinking about how we're dealing with fraud today. And that's why I'm really happy to be part of this webinar today. I'm looking forward to hearing from our participants. One, we'll get to learn a little bit from their insights and their knowledge. But secondly, really want to be able to help the listeners by providing some considerations as you prepare for the goal of instant payments. The other thing I'm kind of looking forward to is being a little bit more on the moderating side of the table versus on the other side. I know how it's been there, so I appreciate it that our panelists are willing to speak with us today. So today's session topic, it's instant payments, and we're talking about fraud mitigation solutions. And this topic's generated a widespread interest across the FedNow community, and not just the FedNow community, but also the payments industry at large. And it should really be no surprise that our FedNow community programming team has received a lot of feedback from the industry asking for, can we hear from service providers? We want to understand how they're contemplating possible fraud problems, and what are some of the potential solutions that, as you know, you might be able to use to mitigate this type of fraud. So with that, I'm really pleased to have three service providers today from FedNow Service Provider Showcase. And so first off, we have Jim Bray, who's Vice President of Sales at Quint Financial Technologies. Thank you, Jim. Jake Emery, who's a fraud prevention subject matter expert at NICE Actimize. Thanks, Jake. And Dave Excel, founder and chief technology officer at Featurespace. And thank you, Dave. So as we get into the session, what we're going to do is I'm actually going to give each of our panelists an opportunity to frame out what they think some of the problems are with fraud and instant payments, and then what are the solutions as they see them. And then ultimately, I'll delve a little bit deeper into those with a little bit question answer segment. And then, as Sierra mentioned, we have received some pre-submitted questions, so we'll try to take a few of those as well. And that should take us through the full time. So kind of rush through that, though. But Dave, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to talk a little bit about what you see.
Great. Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you for organizing this session. I'm really excited to be speaking to all of our attendees. So I guess I thought I'd start off with a little bit of a bit about Featurespace, as some of you may not be aware of who we are. So I was one of the founders of Featurespace while I was fortunate to be studying at the University of Cambridge over in the UK. And one of the areas of sort of passion and interest to me was understanding sort of human behavior, but then the intersection of that with applying it to statistics and how we could start to teach automated solutions to be able to understand that human behavior. And that's really evolved into where Featurespace is today in terms of being now a global fraud and financial crime platform provider, working across a variety of different jurisdictions and different sort of payment types and use cases to really, and our mission is to make the world a safer place to transact. So making sure that all of those things that we take for granted every day, like plugging our power, plug into the power socket and getting electricity, that should be the same for our payment system being very safe and secure. So we have a few key really important things that when we're thinking about what we're about fraud and how we're looking to prevent it from taking place. And one of the things that I guess I've always seen and experienced is fraud is very adaptable. It continues to change. We often put in things to try to stop it in terms of strategies, different models and scores, but the fraudsters are always out there trying to circumvent those systems. So for us, one of the things that we focus on is, well, a majority, and usually over 99% of customers are good, genuine customers. They're the ones that we want to do business with. So when we're thinking about our approach for fraud and risk mitigation, it's how do we learn what are the behaviors of those good customers, and how do we make sure that we can continue to enable those customers to transact and have equitable access to all of the different financial services and products that they want to be able to access. And so by focusing on what looks good, we're able to identify things that change, things that potentially don't feel right, and being able to respond to new types of fraud attacks and anomalies that are taking place. And so that's the underlying premise of when we're thinking about more about advanced analytics and machine learning, to be able to differentiate in what's taking place, to making decisions in either real time, depending on the payment type, but looking at the different scenarios in terms of how customers are using those solutions. So when we think about like our platform and our solution, it needs to be fast. And I guess fast is in a few different vectors. One, in terms of being able to deploy it quickly, to be able to enable institutions and customers to be able to get up and running really quickly, because often you don't want projects that last for months and months and months. You want to be able to get the system up and running. So be able to get to that value proposition very quickly. But also, especially in the aspect of instant payments being accessible in real time. So being able to make decisions in milliseconds, but also then be able to interact with the customer in terms of getting additional authentication if that's required, if the transaction's deemed as being high risk. Secondly to that is being accurate. So being able to make sure that we're differentiating between those good and the bad transactions, to make sure that we're keeping the fraudsters out, but also enabling those genuine customers to take place. But also importantly is to be really explainable, is to be able to give fraud operations teams an understanding about what the analytics is doing in terms of why is a particular transaction being flagged as fraud, so that if you're going into an investigation process, you know where to go and look, and you have the confidence around what the system is doing. And then also being adaptable. One of the things I think we've all learned over the last 2 or 3 years is things continue to change. So we need to be very adaptable to changes of situations. And one of the things that I'm really proud of from our examples of deploying our platform with TSYS as one of the large card issuers is during COVID, our models remained extremely stable. So when the US went into lockdown, our models recalibrated within 3 days, and we were back to the same performance after we saw the huge shift in consumer and business activity, from shifting from a lot of like card present transactions to card not present transactions. And also the shift in terms of different fraud typologies, and also fraud that takes place. We have a large customer base in the United Kingdom, and one of the biggest fraud use cases there is scams, or the other definition of sort of authorized push payment fraud, where the consumer is being duped by the fraudster. They're logging into their own account, they're actually making the transfer, but it's under nefarious circumstances. So being adaptable and being able to identify that is really quickly. So for us, I guess, getting to that time to value is to make the solution very simple. We provide, and a majority of our customers are using our solution in the cloud, so it minimizes a lot of the technology onus on organizations to be able to install the technology. They're then also working really well with the standards that are out there. So the ISO 222 standard to be able to quickly integrate and take in that data, being able to orchestrate into different data providers and different systems that you already have. So when I think about instant payments, it's not necessarily a payment channel in its own right. It's around understanding holistically what that customer is doing. So what are the other ways in which they're transacting from their DDA, and understanding all of those things together. And we really work with our subject matter expert teams to provide that value back. And we've packaged a lot of things around these use cases to enable customers to go through really quickly. So Mike, I guess that's my take on sort of feature space and how then that applies to instant payments.
All right. Well, thanks, Dave. And I will hand it over to Jake. You're up next. You can take it from there.
Oh, thank you, Mike. And speaking in a web seminar, it's really nice to have also met you in person. We were introduced at Not Just Smarter, Faster Payments, which I think facilitated this introduction and opportunity. So hopefully I'll have the same opportunity with Jim and Dave in the future as we start to move away from the pandemic, and for the rest of us, and moving to face-to-face interactions and the information sharing. So first off, introducing NICE Actimize, we're a recognized industry leader and global provider of financial crime solutions. We're really eager to support the financial services community through the knowledge sharing, educational efforts that are bringing us together today. I'd like to thank the Federal Reserve and our fellow solutions providers. Again, Jim Bray with Quinte Financial Technologies and Dave Excel of FeatureSpace, whom I have collectively high respect for, and our collective efforts to protect consumers and fight fraud. And we're all here to support you, our attendees today. I believe, and I believe this strongly, fighting financial crimes and protecting payments innovations like instant payments, has great social impact and value. And I tip my hat to everybody involved in this effort. So to the strengths of our fraud prevention platform, IFMX, or Integrated Fraud Management, it's a next generation, real-time, holistic fraud prevention platform. It's powered by artificial intelligence and supported with our collective intelligence to provide industry-trained machine learning models which increase fraud protection with best-in-class analytics for coverage of all channels. And we are banking industry focused, so whether your platform preference is cloud, hybrid, or on-prem, we're here to support you. Data is the key to supporting analytics and training machine learning models. IFMX is able to connect your entire fraud ecosystem with no-code integration solutions, and we provide a holistic view of customer risk. It's not enough to have artificial intelligence. You must have the smartest AI, and I'll let the panelists laugh a little bit about that statement. It's okay. But we're really able to deliver the largest industry view of financial crime. And again, with our collective intelligence and our 20 years of fraud expertise and depth in data science, that's how we do this. So as you know, fraud attacks are not linear. Your fraud prevention solution should not be. And so without real-time transaction monitoring, your organization is going to really lack or find it very difficult to have that more informed and holistic view of risk. So our solution is end-to-end, meaning we provide policy management or rules management and case management solutions. And these are important functions to have under the same roof. It greatly benefits your organization's overall fraud strategy, and investigators love it. I'm a former fraud investigator myself. I came from industry. It's nice to have that all under one roof. So how do we solve for the challenge of instant payment mechanisms like FedNow 24/7? So we were there with the United Kingdom in 2008 when they went on their experience and journey with instant payments. We have maturity and experience with instant payments presently in the United States because we support the clearinghouse's real-time payment rail. Again, instant payments in the UK, and SEPA instant credit transfers in the European Union. And, as well, our models are covering faster payment mechanisms as opposed to instant payment mechanisms like Zelle and other third-party peer-to-peer payment applications. We already leverage rich ISO 20022 data elements from the rail. And again, with that, coming from our experience with the RTP. And we have RTP specific analytics and dedicated modeling to enable automated fraud risk assessment in real time. And that's extremely valuable. So NICE Actimize ingests the complete conversation and messages, and it provides enhanced decisioning and operations capability. So a little bit to advanced analytics for real-time fraud detection. I think this is especially important for instant payment types. We monitor the customer journey for personalized fraud prevention. As Dave mentioned, the customer impact is extremely important. And we have expert features that identify risks to bring the industry picture to bear and to train our models more quickly. We have flexibility, so we can use your models in conjunction with our models, or you can use our models, which are out of the box. And we've also provided model governance support and explainability. And in my experience on the fraud strategy side, that is a particular pain point for data science teams. So it's really good to have. And so what does this mean for your organization? I think we bring proactive fraud prevention and significant uplifts in value detection. So, really addressing that fraud loss. And on average, we see about 20 to 30%, higher lift than generic machine learning models. Our solutions are personalized to individual consumer risk, which for instant payments often translates into friction. And friction is not the ideal customer service. We want to try to avoid that. And Dave spoke to that earlier as well. So in addition, our solution reduces false positives. That's keeping your investigators happy and keeping them focused on what they do best, is investigating fraud, and that's saving you the operational costs and retaining that important talent. And so with that, I'm very excited again to dive into this topic, and I'll hand it back over to you, Mike. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jake. And Jim, certainly not last but not least, Jim Bray.
Yeah, I'm with an organization called Quint Financial Technologies. Our parent company, you may be familiar with them, called Athene. They've been around for about, I think, around 19 years, building custom software for bank operations. One of our products is that we joined developed with them was fraud incident management. So it's an incident management system that manages the whole fraud case from beginning to end. The system also has a interface with the FinCEN platform for analytics. So we have AI analytics that also can monitor all types of transactions as a horizontal approach to it. And so we're very, what I call holistic. And what makes us holistic is we don't just provide the technology, we also provide the resources such as back office to work fraud cases and then also support your frontline fraud members like in your call center. We've had a number of financial institutions, two very large ones, are now using our resources to now engage in the conversations with clients around their fraud cases. And right now, trying to hire people that are AML BSA certified is becoming a increasing problem because a lot of people, I think, retired during COVID-19. And so what I'm hearing from my clients, that's where their interest is. We just had a call this week with a attorney for a number of banks, and that's what she was looking for, was resources. And so we can work with existing fraud tools that you may already be using. And that's what makes us, like I say, holistic. We have the tools, we have the resources. And with one of our customers, one of the largest credit unions in the country, is using our services. We were able to cut their false positives by 40% compared to their previous processes and systems. And how we do that is we're constantly tuning the algorithms. And that's one of the areas I've seen a lot of customers have been telling me is when I mention to them tuning algorithms, they say, what are you talking about? I'm saying, well, when you get false positives, someone needs to go in there and look what drove that false positive. It's just like in the cybersecurity world where they have SIM tools that manage their cyber events. Anytime you add a device or anything to it, you have to update your algorithms. And so the same thing in fraud, such as implementing the FedNow Rail. Current systems are going to have to be able to accommodate the new FedNow Rail transactions. And as you mentioned earlier, ISO 222 is going to be rolled out in steps, just like the EMV credit card has been, as it is still going on. Because later on they're going to do ATMs and other types of transactions. Right now, it's focusing on the ACH real time. And again, we can provide you resources to help you look at your business processes and different parts of your operations to be able to accommodate the FedNow Rail. Because a lot of people think it's plug and play, and I say, well, it is, but from a software point of view. But when you get into the human factors pieces, that's where you need help from a third party. And because we're like eighth into over 50 major banks, we have the opportunity to see how other organizations manage fraud, and there are differences. And so we're able to help our clients adopt new business practices or best practices around fraud remediation, but also more focused on proactive fraud prevention, because that is what's driving the cost. And as a banker told me the other day, he said, well, interest rates are going up. That's a good thing. The bad thing is fraud's going up along with it. So it's kind of negating it. So we take a different approach, I think, to some of this stuff than other people in the industry. But I think like I said, the key differentiator we have is the holistic, where we're doing the technology and we're also providing the human factor services of people to help you meet your goals.
All right. Thanks, Jim. Well, and thank you to all of you for the insights that you provided. Excuse me. So now I want to transition into a little bit of a conversation between all of us. And so, Dave, I'm going to start with a question for you. And actually, sorry, Dave, but it's a two-parter, so it's not just one question. So as financial institutions start contemplating what they should be doing in support of instant payments when it comes to fraud solutions, where should they start? And then the second part of that would be, if they're already in the business of doing, they're already processing and trying to have fraud controls in place and mitigate existing fraud, how can they shore up the tools they have or even enhance the tools they have to address maybe what might be different with instant payment fraud?
Well, thank you, Mike. It's a great question. I'll try to remember both parts of it. So I think for me, it's almost like I almost take a step back and like think about the customer and what is their user experience going to be when they're accessing instant payments, and how do we want the fraud solution to interact with that experience, both in terms of how they're going to sort of explore and discover that instant payments is available to them. And then what are the different scenarios, like the happy path in terms of the payment goes through without any sort of additional validation required, but also then looking at what do we want to do if we do see potential fraud risk, in terms of, do we want to do additional authentication? How do we want to verify? And thinking about a system that's able to manage a lot of that orchestration into the customer experience, because ideally we want to be able to automate a lot of this as much as possible and take those data sources, so that like we mentioned, is make those AI systems smarter, and they get smarter by having access to very good quality data. So ensuring when we're thinking about that user experience, and not just the instant payment itself. So if we're thinking about a customer that's come through a mobile banking application, tracking through in terms of, well, how did they authenticate, and what did they do prior? Did they check their balance? All of those types of things. Was there a new payee that was added before doing that? So how can we capture that sequence of activity to really understand the intent of what the customer was trying to do? And then I guess when I'm always thinking about sort of introducing like new payment types, I think it comes down to a few things. Is like, firstly, it's the people that you have. And I think it's also understanding the customers, is what is the education that's going to those customers in terms of making them aware of what instant payments is, what are the potential risks of using instant payments, when is it appropriate to use instant payments. If you are doing a large transfer, does it really need to be transferred immediately? Can potentially an existing payment solution being used? So I think it's understanding what the appropriate use case is for instant payments and the potential risks that are associated with that, as well as making sure customer-facing teams in terms of customer support also understand the instant payments architecture and the impacts of that. And then also back into the fraud teams, there's different data often available compared to what's traditionally been done in looking at like an ACH or a check payment. So for me, those are really important. And then I think that you're touching on the second question is around existing controls. So organizations have got processes that they put into place over probably years or decades of experience in terms of fighting fraud up until now and keeping their customers safe. But I think one of the key changes for instant payments, it requires a much more of an immediate decision. So rather than having the time that's available and sometimes the time to look at a series of transactions in terms of a customer may be making 3-4 transactions that comes through over a 24-hour period, now we need to make instantaneous decisions on each of those transactions. So I think it's adapting and sort of rethinking through those processes and say, well, what's the impact now in terms of if I need to make an immediate decision, what other data do I need to be able to support that? And what do I want to do if I'm not comfortable sending that transaction through? So I think that's really important. And then finally, technology is important. So ensuring that you do have solutions that can respond in real time, that are able to integrate into those customer flows and those user experiences, and looking at how those can be adapted. We still see a majority of customers are very comfortable in terms of the rules and the rule strategies that they have in place, and looking at, well, how can we advance those and make them more effective by incorporating elements of machine learning to support where there is potentially more nuance in the decision. So I think there's a lot of solutions out there that institutions may already be using that provide that capability, and it's just ensuring that they're able to be upstream and part of the transaction before the money moves out of the institution.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Dave. And one of the points that you made earlier about the customer education piece is extremely important. But in my experience from industry, the customer education piece only goes so far, right? So you really have to make sure as an organization you're not doing things that are facilitating the social engineering fraud that we're experiencing. So with the Singapore experience with the OCBC fraud incident, the fraudsters were very effective in being able to impersonate the bank. So weaker authentication mechanisms which facilitated that fraud incident. Again, how you're trying to reach out to your customers, communicate with your customers, whether it's through social media, email, those kinds of things need to be also carefully considered. You mentioned as well in how your customer contact teams are interacting with your customers. That also has high impact in that regard as well. I think fraud investigators, and from my experience, we kind of have this assumption, oh, that looks like fraud, and I think people just get into habits about doing things, right? And they don't, I'm not convinced that the customer education is keeping up with the adoption. And even though the noise in industry is extremely high, and we're going to talk about that in regards to faster payments and some of those topics, I really believe that it's also on the organizations as well to take that responsibility and to think about those processes. And again, this to strongly consider what authentication tools they have in place, how they're reaching out to customers, whether it's to drive enrollment or to drive education or for any kind of generalized update. The more silent the authentication mechanism, the more sophisticated the authentication mechanism, the much harder it is for these social engineering fraudsters to take advantage of your customers. So those investments will bring down those fraud losses, improve the customer experience, as we're all speaking about earlier today, and really save our customers the headaches and keep the money out of the hands of some pretty nasty individuals. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. So Jake, thanks for jumping in there. Jim, anything you wanted to add there?
Well, just quickly, as these institutions roll out new products, and I've been working with banks for 40 years, and they keep repeating the same mistakes, and that is they focus on the new product revenue it's going to create, but not the fraud. And Zelle is a good example where everybody got in a hurry to roll it out, and then the fraud started, ramping up, and it was a lot of it due to the bank still using a password as the major defense of the application. And so that's where I think people need to step back and work through the fraud potential issues. So it's like looking up in the rearview mirror of time before you look down that windshield at opportunity. You need to really vet this out. And I've had conversations weekly with bankers, and especially credit unions, that want to do real-time payments, but until you come up with a solution to hold the fraud down, they're not willing to take another step forward. So that's my 2 comments on that.
I definitely appreciate that, and I've been on that discussion of why fraud's important when new products are being rolled out. So thank you for that. While we have you, Jim, I got a question for you. So we heard it already, obviously, that instant payments are 24/7, 365. Are there technologies or strategies that users or institutions should consider to address for the potential fraud impact that they might see?
Yes. I think too many people I've talked to think ISO 222 and the FedNow rails are plug and play. And I say, well, it's not really. It is if at a tactical level or strategic level. You got to look at your review your business processes, how you're going to use the new capability, the new product offerings, and you've got to go through those and look at the workflow, and also look at the vendors that are involved in that eco chain of doing real-time payments. And through that process, you need to have a disaster recovery plan. And when one of the components fails, okay, and a good example is NACHA issued guidance where there's 5 types of ways you can validate a transaction or the account. And so the first level is manual, the old way, and the 5th level is all the way up to doing it automated with an API. Well, you need to have plans that if you're doing it with the API, and it fails, whatever, because it's digital, how are you going to keep moving the business forward? And so you need to work through disaster recovery plans early on, not to wait till they hit, and then say, what do we do now? Because that's what happened back with Zelle. Then people have overreacted, people start clamping things down. And so to get off on the right foot, you got to go through a lot of use cases. And I highly encourage people to think about impact on resources in your call center. Because again, like I've done a lot with military credit unions, they've got people all around the world. Most military credit unions do not offer 24/7. I think Navy does, and maybe Redstone in Huntsville, Alabama. But the thing is, you got to have your call center people available to service the transactions when they go right or wrong. But then also too, you got to have backup plans that are 7/24 with your support vendors, and not have to wait on Monday morning to get help, because that's going to really take a lot of air in the balloon around real-time payments when people's expectations aren't met, that they'll be able to send that money in an hour and it winds up taking 2 days. So that's some of my comments about, what you need to think more, again, holistically, okay, and not just look at the technology.
Right. Jake, Dave, anything you want to add in there?
I couldn't agree more on the call center. I think this is going to have challenges. It definitely, customers are going to experience those issues, and for the smaller institutions, where there's lack of automation, and maybe some of the not having some of those customer service options offline. So yeah, it's definitely going to be. We're going to definitely have to plan both from a technology solution and an operational impact consideration. 100%. I couldn't agree with Jim more about that.
Okay. All right.
And I think, Mike, for me, another thing is making sure that the technology decisions, that it becomes very adaptable and agile to changing needs and requirements, and giving organizations the confidence and simplicity to be able to make changes to their fraud strategy. So if there is a phone call at 3 a.m. in the morning because something's going wrong, it's very easy to put in a potential new mitigation in place without having to, again, wait for a vendor to be available. So a lot of what we focus on is making that self-service and providing the confidence of when those changes are being put into place, is the understanding the true impact of those changes and going through, because ultimately you don't want to then be woken up at 4 a.m. when the change that you put in place didn't have the intended consequence. So I think those things are really important in terms of managing a 24/7 experience, because no one wants to be woken up in the early hours of the morning.
Right. I totally can appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right.
And
Go ahead, Jim. You had a comment?
Forgot to mention, we're just now putting our information into the Showcase Provider Showcase. It's not in there right now. It should be in there next 2 weeks. So we're working through that right now. So if you go into the showcase looking for Quinty Financial Technologies, you won't see us in there today, but in the next 2 weeks you will.
All righty. All right, Jake, I got a question for you. I'm sharing the wealth here. So, anytime a new product or a new solution comes along, fraudsters try to capitalize on those, take advantage of maybe some of the vulnerabilities that weren't identified, maybe in testing, that type of thing. Either can exploit the channel, the product, the user, the financial institution, et cetera. Are there any lessons that you or your company can share about how other countries have done it? You mentioned earlier on you were around with UK back in 2008. Anything you want to share there?
yeah, well, first and foremost, integrated and holistic view of the customer life cycle, I think is extremely important. Dave mentioned it in his previous comments. Jim mentioned in his previous comments. I think the UK market and specificity, excuse me, they have much more experience than us, both in the availability and adoption by their local consumers of instant payments. And correspondingly, as we're not surprised to hear, the social engineering fraud is really a huge problem there. With regards to authorized payment fraud, or what in the UK, as Dave mentioned earlier, they call APP, or authorized push payment fraud. And there, we're talking about a 580 million pound plus problem. And when I was a student in Northern Ireland, 580 million pounds back in the day was $1 billion problem. It's not so much that anymore, but so the experience is quite telling, guys. This is a country with the population size of about the state of California, and it's got $1 billion authorized fraud problem. That is significant, to say the least. So, I think when I make a statement like that, I'm often remembered that you'll never survive in fraud prevention if you don't have a sense of humor. A little bit of dark humor there for you. But I think what I would like to say about the UK experience is what their regulators are doing there is very interesting. And so when I talk to bankers in the US that are in the know on that, they're very concerned, because in the United States, Reg E protections only apply to unauthorized transactions. But as we're going to find out here very shortly, I believe the CFPB, and this is no surprise, this is not a great prediction, they are going to use their enforcement power to bring those protections over to authorized fraud transactions. And what's also interesting in the United Kingdom, this also came out very recently, and it's causing quite a stir and a little bit of controversy, is some of the major banks in the UK, Santander, TSB, Lloyds, and others, have proposed a polluter pays principle. And they, in response to the pressures that they're feeling, the very understandable pressures they're feeling, and their discomfort with liability shifts to their institutions, they're saying, hold on here for a second. All these romance scams are happening on social platforms. They're happening, social media companies. Why aren't they helping to address the loss picture? Why are we absorbing that loss entirely? There are different opinions about that, and partially, that's somewhat of a political issue. So I'll reserve my opinion in that regard. But I would say it's definitely I think it's informing, their experience is informing our regulator view. It's cross-pollinating our regulators' views on how they want to handle liability shifts, because of course the United Kingdom has much more experience with instant payments, and again, common law jurisdiction, very advanced regulatory environment there. So, I think the consumer complaints are, again, it's a shared experience. So in the UK, they have a high complaint volume. In the United States, CFPB and others, they're definitely, hearing those complaints. And when I was on the industry side, we were getting the questions and feedback from the regulators about those complaints. It's driving a lot of pressure. So I think following the UK experience, again, I don't think U.S. banks should be surprised that authorized fraud, and now there's this new terminology in the industry called fraudulently induced payments, and it's actually in proposed legislation. If anybody wants to look that up, to extend those authorized payment protections to Reg E. I think that's also going to become part of our industry lexicon. But, again, I think with some of these faster payment mechanisms, other regions experience challenges. They have regulatory impacts. They can't employ friction necessarily. They have to make a decision, or they have to decline. They can't slow down the transaction. It's either going to go through because they don't have a concern, or they're going to stop it because they've clearly identified fraud, and they're making those decisions in seconds. So I'm talking about the EU experience. So I think that's all informing our picture of where potentially we could go, using the UK experience, using other regional experiences. I understand that in Singapore, the shared responsibility model, or the polluter pays principle, is also being considered with regards to both social media companies and telcos. In Taiwan, they're looking at liability shifts. Again, in the UK, liability shifts are going to come very, very quickly through legislation. We're expecting CFPB. So there's a lot of different regions, a lot of different countries that are, taking this experience with social engineering scams, but they're putting the pressure on the banks. And so the banks really have to have that solutionality, that investment in risk solutions, the holistic understanding of their customer risk. And again, to, what Jim says, good plans in place when things go wrong, and having the tools that can quickly adapt to those acute circumstances, particularly when you're not in operating hours, as Dave mentioned earlier. I think those are all important experiences.
All right. Well, thanks, Jake. So we have we might have a couple of minutes. So Dave or Jim, if there's anything you wanted to add in there, especially from your experience.
Yeah. So I guess a few things, and I use the UK, is that there's some good examples from there, and one that's quite entertaining is actually HSBC did a great video series in terms of educating their customers about scams. So I'd actually encourage people to search for those, and they've got some really good short videos in terms of increasing education and awareness about scams that can take place. But also, one of the things I think about the introduction of faster payments in the UK was the initial way in which that system was protected was to almost put a fortress around a lot of the digital real estates that the banks had. So I remember as being a consumer of the banks, is I was sent one of those card readers. So every time I need to log into my bank, I had to insert my debit card into that. I had to put a PIN number in, and then I had to put another number in, so that the user experience was really poor. But it then gave the bank sort of some view of that customer was authenticated, so that they could then trust all the actions that were taking place subsequently to that, which is now why I do see that we have seen that rise of scams. Is one, that the fraudsters knew that they needed to bypass that authentication, so they needed the customers to go and do that. But also the banks had a false sense of security. They thought because the customer had authenticated, everything from that point on was legitimate. So I think it's really important to continue to monitor all of that activity, to continue to verify that everything's going forward. And I think the final thing is also to think about, because the money is moving a lot quicker, is there's also the onus on looking at the funds that come into your institution. So if fraud is taking place, it's likely that that fraud is going to be moved to another account. So to be able to not just look at the outbound transactions, but also monitoring inbound transactions and understanding if there's a potential mule account, which will then be further used to move that money around potentially outside of the financial system. So I think those are really important things to understand and consider.
Great.
You know, one thing I wanted to jump in. Do you remember, Mike, 20 years ago when American Express tried to employ those little card readers at the desk? That lasted for, I love that Dave brought that up, because that lasted for like 20 seconds in the market in the US.
Right.
You know,
I still need mine to log into my UK bank account. So gone away from
So
yeah.
I might be out of turn here, but I did want to mention something, Dave. You kind of touched on it, so I was going to throw it out there just because as we transition into some of the questions from the panel or to us from the audience, one of them is around: are there any other tools available to help financial institutions understand ways that common fraudulent payments occur, especially within instant payments? And so before I turn that over to you, I also wanted to just throw out that there is a tool that I'm aware of, and Dave, you're probably very familiar with it. From a campaign perspective, the UK has a Take 5 campaign that and I see some nods to the heads, where they're really trying to educate the consumer about the scam, frauds, and authorized push payment fraud and that type of thing. So again, you know, there are a lot of campaigns here in the US as well, and I think education is very important, but there are some of those tools out there as well. So I'll turn it around to you guys. Are there other tools or other things that you think people should use to try and get themselves more educated around the common ways that fraud happens within instant payments?
Well, one that hasn't been discussed on this call so far, and its potential, and it's using the biometrics in your smartphone to authenticate transactions. So you have AI running in your system. It looks at a transaction. It's $10. Who cares? It's $100, $1,000. Let's validate that transaction before it goes executed. So think of PSD2 in Europe, what you do for online transactions. If you apply that to all transactions, then your fraud would dramatically drop, but it's going to slow things down because the transaction is not going to be executed until people respond to that. And so I know in the UK, in Europe, when they went into PSD2, I was talking to our banks there, and they said, well, that was the issue, was training the customer to know that. But then it's kind of like the EMV chip. Once people start using it, you can't take it away from them. And so I think that's the next stage in fraud is, and it doesn't have to be, you have to log in with biometric. You just get an API call, light your phone up, your app on your phone, and it says, you know, do a biometric to authenticate your transaction. Or you can not even use biometrics, just hit yes or no, kind of like Google Authenticator. You know, I mean, it goes a lot further because SMS text messaging is another option, but it's not two-way and it's not designed for that. That's why Google actually created the authenticator they did, because they were looking at using SMS and saw the holes in it. And they said, yes, something needs to be in-band and encrypted. And so again, I think that's the next phase of analytics, automation moving forward, is pulling in the ability to do that kind of transaction authentication.
You know, I think it's an excellent point that Jim makes, because, you know, these weaker authentication mechanisms are actually technically regulatorily non-compliant. The FFIEC has strongly warned organizations that, you know, having simple SMS-based authentication is a weak authentication mechanism. They strongly recommended the organizations in their updated guidance that was issued last year to move away from these authentication mechanisms. And so one of the things that, you know, Jim mentioned, you know, was that, you know, Apple, Google, Microsoft, they're going to move away from that, and they're, you know, we're going to be passwordless for their products very soon. And they already have the authenticator products. I use them on my phone for a lot of different use cases. So I, you know, personally, from where I stand, I think organizations, you know, if they want to facilitate faster and instant payments, they've got to understand their front door. They've got to have solutions for new account fraud, and they've got to understand customers early in the transactive life cycle. we've spoken ad verbatim about authentication management, and Dave and I had a chuckle about the Google, the card readers and stuff. That one definitely took me back. The American consumer is very different than the European consumer, British consumers. And behavioral biometrics, great lift. So, behavioral biometrics, again, is how your customer is interacting with the platform itself. Behavioral analytics is a data solution, it's looking at device features and those types of things. The biometrics is, mouse clicks, keyboards, it's really trying to protect against some of those automated lists. And there are use cases, obviously, for authorized fraud. And as well as, thinking about payment fraud solutions, because we know that there's, and to be fair to all of us, not one solution is going to solve all your fraud problems. So you have to augment your risk, the way that you handle risk. How are you handling check fraud? How are you handling crypto transaction risk? How are you monitoring the deep and dark web? These are all solutions that, I think organizations also need to take a look at. It's both considering the fraud that we have and the old fraud, as well as dealing with the newer and faster payments mechanisms and the fraud that follows that. The old is still new, and so you really have to have that holistic picture to adequately handle these challenges, because the fraudsters, they're going to shift from channel to channel wherever they can find your weakness. And I say this a lot in industry webinars, just the fact that the fraudster can get on your platform, that account in and of itself has value. And we're not talking about a credit line account, we're talking about just a DDA account. Boy, they can hit you, and they'll hit you hard. They'll hit you with disputes, the friendly fraud, and they'll try to see where your other weaknesses are in your mobile applications. It is really a very difficult environment to be a fraud strategy leader nowadays. And so I really tip my hat to those leaders that are on the call. They are under an extreme amount of pressure, guys. And so, we all collectively recognize that, and we're here to help.
So Jay, thank you for that. And one of the things that I didn't, I think you guys have been alluding to it all through the session, but I haven't really actually maybe heard the actual terms of multi-factor. But I think, or multi-level, whatever you want to call it. But what I hear from you is that there's not one solution. You have to do a lot of different things to really protect your organization. And so it could be authentication, it could be transaction detection, looking at biometrics to try and authenticate from that perspective. But there's different tools, and we all do things differently. But I think each institution kind of has to look at that and try to really understand what's right for them. Would you agree with that?
No, definitely. And also understanding what's right for their customer base as well, and what is the experience that they want to provide.
Right.
And I think it continues to be a very dynamic situation. And I think one of the key things for success is collaboration. It's sharing those ideas, sharing across the industry, because I think that's where we're all here. We have a common goal is to reduce fraud across the industry. So where we all work together against that is where we can be very powerful. We know the fraudsters are out there, they're sharing information, they're sharing their tactics. So we need to be doing the same in terms of how we defeat them.
One other topic we didn't discuss was insider threat. And I'm focused on that heavily right now because a lot of VPs of fraud are calling me saying, okay, there's a lot of great tools out there facing the customer, but my bigger problem now is my insider. So I won't get off on that subject now, but in future webinars, we need to do one just on the cyber threat, because the bad guys are pivoting to the parking lot with a bucket full of cash saying, hey, you need a few extra bucks. I've seen that happen in banks before where they'll compromise a teller or somebody. So I'm just saying that's another topic that we didn't discuss in this call today. Maybe we can in future webinars.
Well, yeah, it's an excellent. Oh, sorry, Mike, not to interrupt you, but that's an excellent point, because that's where they're going to take the proceeds of this instant payment fraud. They're going to take it to crypto, and if you don't have those solutions and understanding, then yeah, you're in the blind. We have a marketplace. We provide a lot of different solutions. Again, it's a community effort. It really is. Anyway, thank you.
All right. Well, I know we're close on time, so I was going to take one more question. Actually, I was going to make one other comment around tools that are out there, and this isn't going to necessarily solve your problem, but I think it can help bring a light to some of the problems within organizations. Is a couple of years ago in 2020, the Fed worked with the industry to come up with a fraud classification model, and we call it fraud classifier. And that tool allows people to really try and look at fraud from a consistent view. We've laid it out from different ways to categorize fraud, but also provided consistent definitions for fraud, because what we found is people were talking about fraud differently. They were classifying it differently. And when we were trying to get how big is the problem, we couldn't always get apples to apples. So we've seen quite a bit of movement in this now. There's people adopting our model or the industry model. And so if you are interested in that, it can be found at fedpaymentsimprovement.org. And then just watching the time, there was one other question that came in that I was going to actually address. And this was, it says, the question was, what fraud protections will FedNow Service provide? So I'll take this one, but, I would say just with as with other payment types out there, the financial institutions are really the primary line of defense when it comes to these fraudulent transactions. And so they still got to do that. As you just heard Jake and Dave and Jim say, you got to understand what's right for you. And so you got to kind of address the fraud that's coming there. However, I did want to mention that the FedNow service will also act as a resource center to both the senders and receiver on the transactions to help mitigate fraud. And this session today was really just intended to be a more broad view of instant payments and some of the fraud around it. But last month, the FedNow community actually held the first of 2 webinars, and they're on fraud and so on aspects of FedNow service. So the recording of the first one will be available very shortly, but just know that there's a webinar, there is focus on fraud, and there will be a webinar around that as well. So with that, I just wanted to say that's all the time we have for today. And I wanted to thank each of my panelists. So Dave, Jim, Jake, thank you very much for your time, as well as the insights you shared today. And then if there are any questions related to today's discussion, you can email us at the SYS FedNow community at chi.frb.org. And then also you will receive a short post-event survey. And if you would be willing to complete that and send it back to us, we really appreciate the feedback so we know what we can do in the future. So please be on the lookout for that. And again, thank you to our listeners. Thank you for your time and joining us today as well. Thank you.